and founder of the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice. Before we launch into our program today, I just want to quickly, for those of you who are not familiar with CSAJ, give you a sense of who we are and what we do. So the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice sits at the intersection of domestic and sexual violence and economic justice and social inequality. Our vision is of a world where all people have equal access to physical safety, economic security, and human dignity. And CSAJ's mission is to promote advocacy approaches that remove systemic barriers, enhance organizational responses, and improve professional practices to meet the self-defined needs of domestic and sexual violence survivors. Today's program is, of course, focused on student loans, and I'd like to introduce you to our faculty today, Persis Yu, who is a staff attorney and director of the Student Loan Borrower Assistance Project with our longtime partner, the National ConsumerLaw Center. So very, very happy and honored to have you with us today, Persis. At this point, I'm going to turn the program over to Sarah Wee, who is CSAJ's Director of Research and Programs.
Hello, and thank you. Yes, hi, I'm Sarah, and thanks for that welcome and intro, Erica. We would love to also, while we're introducing Persis, if you all could introduce yourselves. We already have 50 people in the room, so as folks continue to trickle in, let us know who you are, your name, your organization, maybe where you're located, if you feel comfortable, as well as any questions or concerns or other things that you're bringing with you or hoping to get out of the webinar today. We plan for this to be super interactive and have lots of ways to engage you in that. So start by letting us know who you are. And already we've got folks from Texas, Florida, Georgia, Ohio. We are crossing the country. This is great. So keep that coming, and we will keep talking with you in the chat and once we get started. So I just wanted to give you a lay of the land. What we're hoping to accomplish today is really enhancing our individual advocacy as it relates to student loans. So after today's training, we hope that you feel a little bit more familiar with how student loans impact survivors and their families, feel able to issue spot the different kinds of loans survivors might have and where problems arise, and also be able to discuss some of the pitfalls and challenges when getting, especially when getting into income-driven repayment plans. And then finally, we'll really be relying on all of you in conversation to explore strategies, challenges, and help develop some of those together. And Persis will go over this a little bit more, but this is what we're planning to cover, both an overview of what's happening with student loans and the student loan system, and then go a little bit more in depth in terms of how that shows up for survivors, as well as into repayment plans. So again, we are thrilled to have Persis really lead the charge in kind of demystifying and walking us through some of this. So before we really dive in, I have an announcement, and then just wanted to offer a little bit more framing to our webinar today. So we are really interested in hearing what you all are doing, whether it's in student loans, in barriers or accessing education more broadly, and what that means for survivors' economic security or other areas of economic and consumer work. So I'm going to copy in a link to our form, and we are trying to interview, have video interviews with spotlights on innovation. So please let us know what you're doing and if you're interested in this, particularly around the issues we've been discussing today and we're chatting about a couple weeks ago with Karen Chapkus in the bankruptcy webinar. Okay, so just a little framing, because this is in part an effort to implement our guidebook. CSAJ's guidebook is a comprehensive guide on consumer and economic civil legal advocacy through a very intentional survivor-centered lens. So Persis will be touching, Persis wrote one of our chapters and has been partnering with CSAJ for a long time, and also does a lot of other incredible writing and training on various student loan issues, and she'll be pointing to that. And she'll be touching on some of the important aspects of her in really all chapters, and I wanted to highlight some of those just to orient us all before handing it off to Persis. So first, survivor stories. An important question for us is always, how do these issues show up in the lives of survivors? And how does it show up differently based on survivors' intersecting identities? So the guidebook, each chapter in the guidebook offers case scenarios to ground each chapter, and Persis will be doing the same today. And so you'll see the storybook icon pop up whenever that happens. So keep a lookout for that, and please engage with us in working through some of these case scenarios and sharing your own. Second, issue spotting and some think about it tips. Sorry, skipped ahead. Connected to survivor experiences that I just kind of overviewed, we also promote, the full assessment and critical reflection about what we as advocates bring to the table and how to work in partnership with survivors' own expertise. So the magnifying icon kind of lets you know when we're offering up some helpful ways to either issue spot, screen for, and also open discussion with survivors about student loans in this case. And importantly, that also helps you link it to other needs and priorities that you may be working with survivors. And then finally, we really talk about what can we actually do. And often strategies and legal remedies might look different to meet survivors' unique safety needs, which everyone in this room is well aware of. And so we really work to gather some really practical tips from practitioners in the field. And we also provide some additional ideas to help you further adapt any given strategy to your own organizational and community context. And so you'll see that in this light bulb icon that pops up today, and you'll see it throughout each guidebook chapter. And then just to underscore that it's important that we hear from you all who are doing this work day in and day out, so please take this opportunity to engage with us and ask questions. So that is some of the background I wanted to give to help link the guidebook as a written resource to what Persis is going to talk about today. And I'm really, really thrilled and honored to invite and welcome Persis. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Oh, I was just going to say before you launch in Persis that I just really want to acknowledge the diversity of experience that folks are bringing to this call. As you were talking, Sarah, I just want to recognize that there are people from statewide domestic and sexual violence coalitions who are joining us. There are folks from legal services, from community-based organizations, both of the sort of mainstream variety as well as those specifically focused on marginalized communities. With varying expertise in terms of student loans and economic justice work. So we are very grateful that you are all with us today and look forward to learning from one another.
Incredible.
Yes. Thank you so much, Erica and Sarah, and to your organization, CSAJ. I'm really excited to be here for this webinar and to talk to all of you. I'm really excited about how engaged everybody is so far, and hope that we can continue and bring some good information about student loans. So just to get started here, let me just tell you a little bit about who I am and what the National Consumer Law Center does. I direct a student loan borrower assistance project at NCLC, and we run a national listserv of student loan advocates. We publish a book, which you can see the beautiful cover there, on student loan law, We also do other publications, do reports. We do some case consultation and policy advocacy. And we also have a fairly unique resource, unique within NCLC, the Student Loan Borrower Assistance website. And this is, I think, a really good resource for folks on this webinar. It's a self-help material, but what we really tried to do is digest the legalese, the regulations in the Higher Education Act into something that is useful for borrowers. So hopefully you all will get a good, will be able to use that, and but you are always welcome to contact me with any kind of questions. To dive in, why are we talking about student loans? And the student loan crisis is a phrase that comes to my attention a lot. But looking at student loans, we're looking at $1.5 trillion of debt, which is the highest amount of unsecured credit in the country, so it's second only to mortgages. And I think it's really instructive when we're thinking about the folks that we work with to think about who owns student loan debt, who holds the student loan debt in this country. And about 2/3 of that is held by women. There are 43 million student loan borrowers altogether, so roughly 1 in 5 adults in the United States, and there's a huge amount of distress. I have that 8 million in default. I think I actually just saw a new statistic last week which says that it's now 9 million. Statistics are actually really terrible in the student loan space. There's not great data collection, but we know that about 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 student loan borrowers is experiencing some kind of distress or in default on their student loans. And unfortunately, that impacts borrowers of color, women, disproportionately. The other thing that kind of doesn't get a lot of attention is that a lot of the people who are experiencing the most distress on their student loans are not folks with the hugest amounts of student loan debt. So we hear a lot of stories in the media about, folks with 6 figures of student loan debt. I'm sure many of the people on this webinar here have large sums of student loan debt. But folks who struggle on student loan debt actually have relatively much smaller amounts, and about half of all loan defaults are actually less than $10,000. And I think we can think about the experiences of the folks that we work with, and for a lot of people it doesn't matter if it's $5,000, $50,000, or $100,000. A debt is a debt and they can't afford it. In terms of the folks that we're looking at survivors, why is this important? And I think looking more holistically at what student loan debts will help do for folks. It's a very unique credit product. Student loan debt is tied to whether or not one can continue to get their education. And for a lot of folks, if they're in default on their loans, they cannot get new federal loans, and they also can't take out Pell Grants. So even if they want to go to, their local community college and get a cheaper education, they may be prevented from doing that if they have student loan debt. The other thing is to think about folks' current financial capacity and how the student loan debt might be impacting that. If a borrower is in default on their student loans, the government can garnish their wages, they can intercept tax refunds, often for many people, including the Earned Income Tax Credit, and they can offset federal benefits such as Social Security, retirement, or disability. And obviously this will greatly impact somebody's ability to get back on their feet or move on with their lives or just, provide for their families. There are also things that we can do. So that's the other thing, is that often we can solve these problems for folks. So this is I really like this slide. It talks about kind of every point in kind of when you think about the life cycle of student loan debt and about a survivor's life on where you might see issues with student loan debt occurring. So you have kind of the during phase, during the loan, right? Is there identity theft going on? Are loans being taken out with their permission? Is there coercion? There's what happens if you're in school and you need to get safety, right? If you are in school but you have to leave, that's going to have an impact on your loans, on your debt. It's also going to increase other costs at that time, so you might need to take out more loans. while you're repaying the loans, right? You know, are there, well, sorry, I skipped this section, like are there short-term safety considerations that one needs to think about while dealing with their loans, and then really the long-term? What is the long-term effect? You know, student loan debt, unlike almost any other type of credit, has no statute of limitations, so the impact to a borrower can be lifelong. So I'm curious, here, we got a poll here. In your work, do you help clients with student loan debt, and how often? How often do you see this coming up? I love that folks are energetic and answering really quickly. All right, so it looks like we're slowing down on our answering, and it looks like it's mixed, right? So a little less than half of you saying that you never do, whereas the rest of you say that you have, but on varying amounts. Sounds like the next big category is on occasion. So let's move on to the next question, because what I'm really curious is, what are you, for those of you that are seeing student loans appear in your practice, what are you seeing? And how is it showing up in the work that you do? And you can just answer this in the chat box, because I'm really interested in hearing, you know, what folks on the ground in your experiences. So I appreciate folks that have responded, and you know, as we're going through, I encourage you to continue to share your stories and your experiences, but we see people who are concerned about the affordability of their loans, folks who are concerned about the tax refunds, and that's actually really, that's coming up real soon for a lot of people. You know, the last couple of years I've done a blog post on our website about tax time and how folks are thinking about whether or not to file taxes, when they're going to file taxes, if they're expecting a refund, especially if they're expecting that earned income tax credit, which is, you know, for a lot of the folks that we work with, such a big chunk of money and really a lifeline. What can folks do with that? So I appreciate all of you sharing that. Please continue to enter your stories into the chat box as you think of them. So let's kind of go over digging in, what are we going to talk about today? And so the first thing I think we want to talk about is just assessing the client situation. Do a little issue spotting. What kind of loan does the client have? What are the consequences of the loan that your client has? And then after we kind of talk about that issue spotting, what are the ways out? What are the things that we can do to help them along the way? So as I alluded to, there are different types of student loans. There are the big umbrellas are federal loans versus private loans. This is probably the most important distinction that you can help your borrower find in their loan situation, because their options, their rights, and the consequences are all dramatically different based upon these two different categories. So you can actually even think about federal loans being an entirely different credit product than a private loan. And the federal loans are all authorized under the Higher Education Act, whereas private loans are more contractual relationships. You were looking at more promissory notes, whatever your state law is under on loans and contracts. So how do you know if the borrower has a federal student loan? The gold standard of figuring out what type of loan your client has is the National Student Loan Data System and getting what we call the NSLDS report. And I do want to flag that the website has actually changed, and I apologize that I didn't get it updated in time for these slides, but we can send out an updated slide. So it's nslds.ed.gov. The Department of Education has gotten rid of the wwws in their websites, which is just confusing, and unfortunately they don't point to like the new website. But anyways, that's where you're going to go to get the National Student Loan Data System report. One thing that I think is really important to know, because I know a lot of folks, as you're thinking about the safety of your clients gathering information, is your client's safety, and will it generate any kind of record or tip off a potential abuser to where your client is? And accessing the National Student Loan Data System should not do that for your clients. There can be concerns with credit reports sometimes, and a credit report is also another tool that can be useful. But, you know, should feel reasonably safe accessing the NSLDS system. Now, one thing to know, you do need to use an FSA, or your borrower needs to know, and this is just a quick side note that it really needs to be the borrower accessing this information and not somebody on their behalf. But a borrower will need to use their federal student aid ID, and this is like the PIN number for all federal student loan things. So this is the ID you use to get a loan, to get into repayment plans, to change your repayment plan, to get into income-driven repayment. So this is a really very sensitive piece of information, and unfortunately, there are a number of instances of FSA IDs being created by somebody else. So that could be either the abuser, it could be, you know, a debt relief scammer, or other kinds of third parties. Now, it will ask for contact information, and so this is one place where one would want to think carefully about what kind of address to give to the federal student aid ID, because it could appear, it could generate mail, it could generate address on certain documents and that sort of thing. If people are locked out, if your borrower is locked out of their account, there is a number. It's fairly straightforward to reset it, and so, you know, it just takes an email address and some basic information. So this is what the website looks like, what it looks like to enter in the information. This is what you're going to pull up when you get there. And so I showed you before images of promissory notes, and those are helpful. They're helpful to know if that loan is a federal loan or not. But the thing that is really important about the NSLDS system is that it shows you just about all federal loans. So one thing that happens is a lot of borrowers actually have a lot of different loans. You can see that this particular borrower here has 10 loans. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to address the loan situation of one loan and not all the others. So that's why you really want to get this comprehensive look at what the borrower has. Now, for some folks who are older, who have loans from the 70s and 80s, and they are unfortunately out there, it's a little bit iffier about whether or not that loan will appear, but generally if we're talking about a loan from the last couple decades, it's going to be in this system. Importantly, private loans do not show up on this one. So if you have a loan that's only 2 years old and it's not on this system, you can be reasonably certain that that's a private loan. So when you, let me actually go back, if you see here that there's numbers on the side of each loan, you can click on those and you can get more information about the specific loan. It's going to tell you more about the balance, about when it was originated, and I think one of the most useful pieces of information is that it's going to tell you who the current servicer is. So who do you actually need to talk to if you want to deal with that loan? So within the federal loan program, there's you saw on the earlier slide, there's a number of different types of loans, but the two biggest programs are going to be the Federal Direct Program and the FFEL loan, Federal Family Education Loans. The Federal Family Education Loans are the loans that were originated by banks but were guaranteed by the federal government. They stopped originating them back in 2010, but as I mentioned, these loans can last a very long time. Therefore, there's still about a quarter of the federal student loan portfolio is still FFEL loans out there. Now, who you're dealing with causes a lot of confusion because you're dealing with the same players a lot of the time. So, for example, Navient is probably the easiest one to pick on, but Navient they were both a fellow originator, or Sally Mae, who is now Navient, was a fellow originator. So you have FEL loans that are with Navient. Navient is also a direct loan servicer, so you could also be dealing with Navient if it's a direct loan, or it could be a private loan because they also service private loans. So the other thing to look at if you're trying to investigate what kind of loan you have is some of the original loan documents. So if you have the promissory note and it has a TILA disclosure, for example, that's a telltale sign of a private loan. Federal loans are not subject to the Truth in Lending Act. Therefore, if you have those boxes about the cost of credit, that's a private loan. If you see the word cosigner, that's another indicator of a private loan. There are a couple of federal loans, Parent Plus loans and Grad Plus loans, that can have what they're called endorsers, which functionally act like cosigners, but they are not called cosigners. So if you see the word cosigner, you know it's a private loan. All right, so kind of digging into some examples. Here we have our client, Laura. She is a single mother supporting 3 children, working a full-time minimum wage job. She's married to her abuser, but is living separately right now. She's overwhelmed by threatening letters and phone calls from a company called FH Can about a student loan. They're threatening to take her wages and her tax refund, and she's coming to you and she wants to know, can they do that? And so this is probably the type of scenario that one might see. So when we think about this, when we're digging in, what do we need to know? What we want to know about her safety. We don't want to know about her financial goals. But we also want to think about what tools do we need to actually provide her with this information. And of course, our analysis may look different depending on what population, of what community she's coming from. So the first thing is, let's pretend that this is Laura's NSLDS report. So taking a look at that, we can see that she has 3 different loans. We see this really bright and obnoxious triangle with an exclamation point in it, and that is the indicator that Laura's loans are in default. The other thing I didn't mention before is that the NSLDS report also provides some information about the Pell Grants that somebody received. As you may know, that there's a limit to the amount of Pell Grants folks can receive over their lifetime, and so you can see kind of a comprehensive list of when they've done it, but also where they went to school. So digging into one of these loans a little bit more, we can get information about Laura's school. She went to the Everest Institute. We see the dates. We see a little bit about the repayment history as she was there. You can see it was originated, but she didn't actually default until 2013. So there's some interesting stuff in there. But the other piece that I will kind of point you to is the current lender, and you'll see that it's the Department of Education. So we're going to come to a quiz, and this is, if you guys can just put this in your answer in the chat box, but based upon the information on the NSLDS report, and I'll actually pull up that slide again, does Laura have a FFEL loan or a direct loan? All right, you guys are knocking this out of the park already. So great job, everybody. She has a FFEL loan. So what did we learn about her by looking at her NSLDS report? We saw that she has several FFEL loans, or FFEL loans, as we lovingly call them. She went to the Everest Institute. Her loans are in default. Her loans are with the Department of Education's Debt Management and Collection System. So the next question that we want to know is, can they do what they're threatening to do? right? Because that's what she really wanted to know. Can they take her wages, and can they take her tax refund? So we got to dig into what it means to be in default. Default under the Higher Education Act is a very specific thing. It's a word, in consumer law generally with credit products, we think of default as just, you didn't make a payment. But under the Higher Education Act, default has a very specific definition, meaning that after 270 days of non-payment, the loan is then in default. Anything before that is delinquency, and it's different. But at 270 days, the entire loan is accelerated. 100% of it is due. It's then sent to a private collection agency. This actually takes a little bit longer than 270 days. You're probably looking at about 100 days before you are going to see it back at a collection agency. And for folks who have experience working with debt collectors, the experience of student loan borrowers is not very different than any other kind of debt collection. Borrowers are often subject to aggressive and sometimes illegal collection tactics. The fees can go up dramatically. Up to 25% of the principal and interest can be charged in collection fees. There will be negative reporting to the borrower's credit report, and as I mentioned before, borrowers at that point are prohibited from taking out new federal loans or Pell Grants. So the government's collection powers. The government can pursue borrowers forever, as I mentioned. There is no statute of limitations on federal student loans. The Higher Education Act explicitly preempts any state statute of limitations, even on state judgments. The government also has extraordinary collection powers. These are all governed by both the Higher Education Act and the Federal Debt Collection Improvement Act, one of the most misnamed statutes in my opinion. But so the Debt Collection Improvement Act is what explicitly allows the government to take tax refunds, wage garnishments, and federal benefits without ever getting a court order. There are some due process requirements, but they're pretty minimal. The government just has to send out a notice and give the borrower an opportunity for a hearing, but that essentially means there's a form that goes out and says, do you have a defense, and you can check some boxes and provide some documentation there. The federal government does sue borrowers from time to time. It is pretty rare. They sue on average around like 1,000 to 2,000 borrowers a year. So it's not a very common tactic, though the consequences of litigation can be pretty grave for those who are subject to it. And actually, just a heads up, we've gone and done some analysis of the lawsuits that have been brought over the last couple of years, and so we're getting ready to put out a report to talk more about exactly who is sued by the federal government. So here's another quiz to just answer in the chat box. But based upon what we've learned so far, do you think that FH can take Laura's tax refund and wages? And give you a minute here. All right, so overwhelmingly you all say yes. And I really appreciate that finally that somebody did take the bait and said, who is FH-CAN? So the federal government hires, it's complicated, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 22 private collection agencies. They actually do list the actual private collection agencies on their website. So if somebody does have a loan held by the Department of Education and they're being contacted by a company that claims to be a private collection agency for the federal government, you can check to see if they are one of the contractors for the federal government. So FH-CAN is, yes, indeed, one of the contractors that the Department of Education uses. And there is a question here as to, yes, but isn't there a cap on the wages they can take as to not threaten financial well-being? And yes, that is true. They cannot take they cannot take a borrower's entire wages. There is they can take up to 15%, but they must leave, and now I'm going to blank on the formula, but I think it's 30 times the federal minimum wage per week, which is roughly $200, $225 a week. So there is a limit. Whether or not you $225 a week is not threatening their financial well-being, I think is an open question. But there is a limit to how much they can take. And the other thing is that there are defenses that one can raise, and financial hardship is one of the defenses as well. So the good news is there is almost always something that an advocate or counselor can do to assist a borrower. You know, NCLC, we do a very small, limited amount of direct representation, and we typically do work with borrowers to get them out of default and into some kind of affordable repayment plan. This is the checklist approach that we use when we're working with a borrower. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that we get the most complete remedy possible for a borrower when we're working with them, and not just going for the easiest option. Though sometimes the easiest option is where you need to go to, just because of your borrower's circumstances. But in terms of the most complete remedy, we look for some way to cancel the loan. There are a number of different cancellation programs. I'm not going to go into them in great depth today because there's a lot of them and they're nuanced, but you should know that there are cancellation programs available. I'll go into a little bit more in a second. Sorry, just looked at my next slide. So if you can't cancel the loan, can we make the loan affordable? We may need to get them out of default in order to do that first. If that's not really an option, do we at least have a short-term deferment or forbearance? Can we stop the payments, postpone the payments to at least deal with whatever circumstance you're dealing with at that moment? Then we kind of go down to compromise and settlement, which I will admit that I have had very few clients who have ever been able to be in a situation to compromise or settle their loans. And then finally, somewhat as the last ditch effort, is can we challenge the collections? There are a number of abuses in the both debt collection and servicing realm, which borrowers can bring, but it's important to know that while you can challenge these collections, it doesn't necessarily deal with the underlying debt. So this is the list of the broad list of cancellation programs. We have cancellations that are based upon a borrower's school. So did the school close? Did it engage in some kind of little f fraud, falsely certify their eligibility, for example? Borrower defense, I know somebody mentioned a question about borrower defense earlier, and that is a program, that is a discharge where if a borrower has a defense to their repayment based upon state law, or this is in flux because there are currently regulations that just went into effect, but the department is working on, changing those. But the essence of the borrower defense is if there's a defense to repayment based upon state law, that may be grounds to cancel the loans. Death and disability are another grounds, and then many folks know about public service loan forgiveness, teacher forgiveness. And then the last one is that I'll mention, but not go into any depth, is bankruptcy, which is some borrowers do get their loans canceled in bankruptcy. There's a lot of discussion about how that's impossible. It's not impossible, but it is very, very hard, and it's certainly it's very different than other types of credit products. So when we're deciding where we're going to go with the borrower, we need to talk about what are her top concerns. How are these loans impacting her financial situation? What's the short-term, long-term, medium-term goals? What do we need to think about her safety? And how stable is Laura's current situation? Which I'll get into a little bit more. So Laura is currently in default, and if we want to deal with that default, then she needs to get out of default. And there are three ways that she can do that. There's a program called loan rehabilitation, loan consolidation, and then she could just pay her loans in full. So let's talk about why she would want to get out of default. She might want to get out of default because she needs to go back to school. If she's looking to improve her job prospects, she might need to further her education to do that. The amount of her loans just may not be affordable under the amount of the standard plan. She may need to improve her credit to try to, find better housing. And then there's also this looming threat of wage garnishment and tax offset that she needs to deal with. So those are some reasons that she would want to get out of default. Now, I think that there is, importantly, some reasons to not get out of default. And I put this slide in somewhat carefully, but I think one thing that's important to know is that once you get out of default, you then do have an obligation to make regular payments. And depending on what her income is, it may be some amount. And there are a lot of borrowers, we work with a lot of borrowers who are experiencing homelessness, and frankly a lot of them are not in a situation where their lives are stable enough to be able to go through the steps that they need to do to stay on track with their loans. As we'll talk about in a little bit, there are a limited number of times that a borrower can get out of default. So it's kind of like you get only one or two get out of free jail cards, and is this the time that you want to use it? And so I think that's a really important conversation to have with your borrower, especially if they're in a crisis, that this may not be the top priority, and maybe you need to step back and do more, short-term remedies than a long-term solution like getting out of default. The other thing to know is that the borrower may not be eligible to get out of default. One of the pitfalls of having a judgment against them is that loans with judgments are not eligible for either consolidation or rehabilitation. So something to think about is how would you assess this and how would you broach this conversation with the folks that you work with. So going into consolidation. So in my experience working with borrowers, most borrowers choose to consolidate their loans when they're working with a legal aid attorney. Interestingly, the statistics are that more borrowers actually rehabilitate their loans than consolidate them when working with a debt collector. That's largely, in my opinion, tied to the contract, because debt collectors get paid 10 times as much to do a rehabilitation than they do to help a borrower consolidate. But in my experience, most borrowers choose to consolidate. Consolidation is essentially like refinancing their loans. You apply for a new loan which repays off your old loan. To qualify, aside from the bar that I said on a judgment, in order to qualify to consolidate, one must either make 3 payments or agree to pay using an income-driven repayment plan. Borrowers can work with a debt collector to consolidate their loans, but they don't need to. They can go to loans.Gov, enter in their FSA ID, and apply directly for a consolidation. Under the statute, up to 18.5% of collection fees can be added to the principal balance of the consolidation, which means that a consolidation can, in theory, be incredibly expensive. In practice, especially with loans that are held by the Department of Education, that fee has largely been waived, and if a borrower with a Department of Education held loan consolidates their loan, they're charged about $150 in collection fees. So one thing that's challenging is that if you have a FFEL loan, you may not know how much the collection fees are going to be, so there is a little bit of an unknown there. In addition to not being eligible to consolidate if you have a judgment, if your loans are subject to wage garnishment, that is another bar prohibiting consolidation. So that is actually a reason why some of the borrowers we work with do wind up rehabilitating. So rehabilitation, on the other hand, is not taking out a new product. Rather, you are really rehabilitating the loan that you have. And the way that borrowers do that is by making 9 timely payments in a 10-month period. The statutes require that the payments be reasonable and affordable, and the regs have clarified in the last couple of years that, in general, reasonable and affordable is defined as the income-based repayment formula, 15% of discretionary income. There is a minimum payment on rehabilitation where it must be at least $5 a month for those 9 payments. So At a minimum, rehabilitation costs the borrower $45 out of pocket. Under statute, up to 16% of collection fees can be added. Again, if these are department-held loans, they generally waive the collection fees, except for they do take a small piece of each payment that is made. Again, you can't do this if there's a judgment on the loan, but you can rehabilitate your loans if there's active wage garnishment. They don't take the wage garnishment into consideration necessarily when determining the payment, but the wage garnishment will end after the fifth payment. There are also, if the 15% is not affordable, borrowers can use expenses to reduce the payment, but there are some downsides to that. So kind of looking at the two next to each other, rehabilitation. One of the biggest promoted reasons to rehabilitate is that there is a slight credit benefit. It will remove the notation of default on the borrower's credit report. Now, it doesn't remove all the negative history or the missed payments. It is purely this notation of default. There are some borrowers who claim that they don't owe the loan, and they may have a defense to the repayment aside from the borrower defense, and that gets a little bit more technical. But rehabilitating, because it's not a new loan, you're not taking out a new loan, and you're preserving some of those defenses. So that's another reason why folks may want to consider that option. It can also end the wage garnishment, as I mentioned. The benefits to consolidation is significantly faster. Generally, one can consolidate their loans within 60 days, whereas obviously rehabilitation is a 10-month program, and then you also have built in the time when a loan needs to be transferred back to a servicer, so that can cause a significant lag in time. The other benefit to consolidation is that at the time when you file the application, you also simultaneously apply for income-driven repayment. This is actually and some are theorizing the redefault rates on consolidations are actually much lower than they are on rehabilitations. And one of the hypotheses on why that is because through this process of rehabilitating, you go through this one process where you're dealing with a debt collector and you're making a certain amount of payments, and then you have to get transferred to somebody else, and then at that point you need to apply for income-driven payment. And folks think that people are just getting lost through that process, whereas consolidation is much quicker. You do it instantly. You choose your servicer when you consolidate, and then you simultaneously apply for income-driven repayment, and it's a much more seamless process. For folks who need to go back to school, this is another reason because they can do it much quicker. Also has the additional bonus of you don't need to deal with a debt collector. You can bypass them. Some things are the same. Both are subject to some amount of collection fees, and it can vary depending on which kind. And they both are one-time deals. There is a one-time limit on rehabilitation, and consolidation loans have the prohibition that you can't consolidate a consolidated loan unless you're adding onto it a new loan. So what challenges do you face in your advocacy for survivors, and what are you seeing in terms of specifically with student loans or in general with some of the topics that we've talked about?
As we're waiting for folks to share all of their rich experiences, I just want to sort of highlight something that Monica shared. She says, while working with women in shelter, we assess what kind of income they have, how stable. One survivor was able to do loan rehabilitation with no income, and her parents gave her $5 a month to pay on her loans until she was out of default. Then she returned to school and went into deferment.
Yep.
And I wonder, just in terms of barriers, you're talking about sort of how it feels complicated and confusing to many survivors. So that's one of the challenges, and sort of avoiding it because of that overwhelmed feeling. and the time.
And I think that's a really real thing to talk about with your clients, is that it is an incredibly complicated program. You know, it's not set up necessarily to be intuitive, and in many circumstances, things that one thinks of as like good, sound financial advice don't apply to federal student loans. And so, not that that's necessarily super helpful information, but I think it is affirming for folks that, you know, this is complicated and this is hard. And also, that's, I think, a reason to really dig into what do they have the capacity to deal with right now. And so I think the next place that we're going to go talk about is choosing the repayment plan. So let's say we decided we're going to get the borrower out of default, right? And then how do we decide where to go from there? So pulling up the next poll, how many folks here, I've seen it pop up in the chat box a couple times, but how many people here have heard of income-driven repayment plans? We got three options. I know all about it. I've heard about it but don't know much about it, and I've never heard about it before. So thanks, everyone, for participating in the poll. It looks like a good number of you, a little less than half of you, know a lot about income-driven repayment plans. And then about a quarter of you have never heard about it, and the rest, about a third of you, have heard about it but don't know a ton about it. So thankfully, by the end of this, hopefully you will know all about it. But let's kind of dig into the repayment plans a bit. So there are a lot of repayment plans. They're all total, I think the number is 12, and I say think because it really depends on how you count. But there are the standard plans, which are amortized to a 10-year period, unless it's a consolidated loan, in which case it's amortized to a longer payment period. Borrowers can choose to extend their repayment period where it's still an amortized amount, but pulled out over a longer period of time. There are graduated plans, which I think are frankly not very useful, so I'm not going to really talk about them. And then what most of our clients wind up doing is the income-driven repayment. And then there's 6 income-driven repayment plans altogether, though I only listed 4 here. So here's a chart that I'm not going to read everything in it, but the thing to take away with the reason why there's so many income-driven repayment plans is because they all work slightly differently. They were started over a different period of time, and they have different eligibility requirements, and they calculate the actual payment amount in slightly different ways. So you can kind of get into the weeds a lot about them, and this is one of the things that really does make the loans really complicated, is I can't give you a one-size-fits-all answer about what is the most beneficial income-driven repayment plan, for example. But you'll have this slide in your materials to refer back to. But the general gist of how income-driven repayment works is that it takes a portion of your borrower's discretionary income, and the discretionary income for most of them, again, is the difference between their adjusted gross income and 150% of federal poverty for their family size. Income contingent repayment works a little bit differently. Discretionary income is defined a little bit differently, and it's a larger chunk of it. All the income-driven repayment plans have forgiveness if there is a remaining balance after 20 or 25 years, depending on the plan. It's important to know that amount is potentially taxable. Borrowers can apply for the income-driven repayment plans if they have a direct loan at studentloans.gov. There are some FFEL lenders that are not hooked up to studentloans.gov, and so they would need to do a paper application for those. Importantly, Parent Plus loans are not eligible, and this is a pretty big barrier for Parent Plus borrowers. There is a mechanism where they can consolidate their loans and then access income contingent, but they are unfortunately not able to access the more generous income-driven repayment plans, which are IBR, pay, and repay. So the things to keep in mind when trying to figure out which income-driven repayment plan is it depends on whether or not your borrower has a FFEL loan or a direct loan. It depends on their debt-to-income ratio, as whether or not how much the payment will be, and then what dates that they actually took out the loans. And then also whether or not it's a Parent Plus loan, right? So here's kind of the concentric circles of the repayment plans. If you have FFEL loans versus direct loans. And important to note that private loans are not eligible for any of these plans. These are restricted to federal loans. So in the cross-section of the federal direct loans and the FFEL loans is we have the standard plans, we have the graduated plans, the extended plans, and original IBR. This is 15% of the discretionary income above 150% of income. That one is eligible for FFEL loans. But for pay-as-you-earn, repay, or the new income-based repayment, which is the lower payment amount, they have to be direct loans. And also, importantly, if you're looking for public service loan forgiveness, you have to have a direct loan. And again, Parent Plus, and I haven't even mentioned Perkins much in here, but Perkins also have different rules. All right. So I brought back the top sheet of the NSLDS report and kind of pop quiz for you guys. Which plan is Laura eligible for? So is she eligible for income-based repayment? Is she eligible for repay, IBR, and repay, or it depends? And you can put your answer, in the chat box. All right, so I see we have some lawyers in the room. I appreciate, Brian, your comment always picks, it depends. So certainly right now she's in default, so she's actually not eligible for any of them, is actually the current answer. So the question is, it depends on what she wants to do. If she rehabilitates her loans will remain FFEL loans, and therefore she will only be eligible for IBR. But if she consolidates her loans, the only consolidation program that's remaining now is a direct loan program. So she would then, at that point, have a direct loan, and she could be eligible for both IBR and repay. So that was a tricky question, and I appreciate you all playing along with me. So to dig in more about, how do we get that repayment amount? What are we looking at? Now, one thing that frustrates me in a lot of the discourse on income-driven repayment is this conversation about why does anybody default when they could have income-driven repayment, as if we know something is affordable because we know what your income is. And that's obviously not true. We know working with people in real life that people have different expenses and different issues come up. And so, but income-based repayment, income-driven repayment, is really about income. It's not about other expenses. So when we talk about discretionary income, we're looking at a very straight calculation. We're looking at adjusted gross income, family size, and the federal poverty rate for that amount. So those are the three pieces of information. The fact that your borrower has a lot of medical expenses, the fact that, money is being siphoned off, these are not things that get taken into consideration with when we calculate the income-driven repayment amount. So this is, if you want to do the longhand calculation, are certainly able to do that. You take the borrower's adjusted gross income, which typically is taken from their tax return, though you can do that with alternative documentation. You subtract 100% of the federal 150% of the federal poverty for that borrower size. So we're assuming here a family size of 3. Take the difference, multiply it by the repayment formula. So for the old income-based repayment, that was 15%. For the new plans, it's 10%. You get the amount that it would be over the year and divided by 12. And there you go is your repayment amount. For the rest of us, there's actually just a website that you can go to and you can plug in the information and it will spit out how much the repayment amount. This is a screenshot from the Department of Education's student loan repayment estimator. It's a pretty good estimator of what the current payments would be. I don't tend to look too much at the other columns because, frankly, they use some assumptions that I think are questionable about how much people's income increases over time. But nonetheless, I think it's very interesting. Also, the other thing to know is that the repayment period may not be accurate because it's not super sensitive to whether or not a borrower has graduate loans or undergraduate loans, and all these things are important factors. So there's some caveats, but if you want to know just what the payment would be right now, it's a really useful tool for that, and it can tell you across just about all of the repayment plans. So married borrowers. So married borrowers are actually treated differently under the plans. So borrowers must first choose about whether or not they're going to file their taxes jointly or if they're going to file their taxes separately. And for some of the plans, that makes a difference, and for other plans, it doesn't. For income-based repayment and pay-as-you-earn, the income during repayment will only take into consideration the spouse's income if the borrower files their taxes jointly. Repay, on the other hand, though, will look at the spouse's income regardless. But borrowers who are legally married but separated are treated as single. And it doesn't matter whether or not they have a legal separation agreement or whether or not they just have an informal separation. The Department of Education doesn't get into all of that. If they are separated, they're allowed to check the box on the repayment application that says that they're single. So, poll for all of you. Have you worked with a client who does not have access to their spouse's income? So overwhelmingly, you all say that you have worked with a client who does not have access to their spouse's income. This was actually something that CSAJ and NCLC worked together on during this rulemaking when they created the repay rules, because initially they weren't going to create any kind of exception for folks. And so one of the exceptions that they did create through a lot of negotiation and through the presenting of a lot of borrower stories about the hardships that survivors and other folks, it's not just for domestic violence issues, but that folks face when trying to access their spouse's income for this requirement. So as a result, there is now a checkbox where borrowers can say, I do not have access to my spouse's income, and they can then be treated as if they are single. under the repay plan. So that's the current situation. I will say that this is a little tenuous, and some folks, some servicers don't like this checkbox approach. I like it because I don't really want a servicer to be in the position of needing to provide restraining orders or otherwise, talking to social service agencies. That's not, I think, what their role is, and I really don't think that they would do it well. So right now we have a situation where borrowers who can't access it are able to check this box, and I think that that is about as best of a solution as we can get if they're going to continue to require borrowers to provide their spouse's income. So here is a handy slide just to kind of lay out for you, whether or not what they're doing, what kind of income they're going to look at. IBR is 15% of either the joint or the separate income, depending on the tax status, but repay, it's the different. It's always both spouses, unless you can check that box. Now, this is a practice tip. So while the rules don't require spouse's information, unfortunately, servicers right now are asking for spouse's information regardless of repayment plan. And some of the reason for that is that there is one form that borrowers use for all the different repayment plans. And so the explanation the Department of Education has given me is that some borrowers will choose repayment plans that they're not actually eligible for, and therefore the department needs all the tools and all the information in order to, figure out what they might be eligible for. So that is creating a challenge for a lot of folks right now. If a borrower knows that they're not eligible, if a borrower knows that they are going to apply and they are eligible for one of the other repayment plans that does not require spouse's information, and they're not able to check the box that says that they can't access their spouses, if they just don't provide it, this is one of these places where practically a lot of servicers won't reject an application if it doesn't have the spouse's information attached, if it's not required for the repayment plan they're applying for. But they can, and that's not always the case. So that's just something to be aware of. The other thing to be aware of is that income-driven repayment plans require borrowers to renew their plans every single year. This is another reason why I think it's incredibly important for borrowers to think about their current and their long-term situation when they're getting out of default, for example. Because the default rates at the point of recertification are unfortunately very high. So what borrowers must do every year is they must provide their current income and current family size, and if they fail to do that, their payments can go way up. And like I said, this is one of the biggest challenges we have because people move, they don't get the notice that it's time to recertify. The notice, either email or mail, that comes to tell them that it's time to recertify looks like every other piece of mail that they get from their servicer, and so often they're not able to distinguish. So one of the things that I try to counsel the borrowers that I work with is just to know when when that date should come up. And they don't have to wait for, the notice. If they know that every November that's their time to recertify their loans, they can do so proactively. It's not actually, if the borrower has pretty standard income, which obviously many of our clients do not, it can be very simple. It can take about 15 minutes at loans.Gov. It's very similar to the process of applying for income-driven repayment. If they want to pull up their tax return, they can use the IRS tool that's built into the website to pull up their tax return. If they have no taxable income, they can also certify that there on the website. Where it gets trickier is for borrowers whose tax situation last year looks very different from their current situation, but they are working, so they do have taxable income. So then those folks are going to need to provide pay stubs. And that can delay the process a little bit, and it can be just, logistically more challenging to do that. So let's go back. Let's talk about Laura again. What did we do for her? We investigated the types of loans that Laura had. We saw that she has the FFEL loans that are actually currently held by the Department of Education. We first explored to see if she had any cancellation options. And I didn't mention it at the time because we had a lot of slides to go through, but we saw that she went to the Everest Institute. And the Everest Institute is one of the schools that, it's a school that was owned by Corinthian, which many of you know imploded and is subject to a number of enforcement actions across the country. And actually the Department of Education, under the last administration, had done some investigations and published findings that borrowers in certain cohorts of Corinthian schools were presumptively eligible to have their loans discharged. There's all sorts of litigation and delays in that process right at this moment, but it's certainly, if you see that someone went to Everest or a number of other for-profit schools, it should be a flag to look to see, is there a potential borrower defense application that one might want to do? Is there a potential, Corinthian also closed, is there a potential closed school option for her? So you're going to want to explore those first. But assuming that those don't apply, then you're going to want to talk about what is the long-term plan. Do we want to get Laura out of default? Is she in a situation where she wants to get out of default? And if she does, which plan do we use? Do we rehabilitate her loans or do we consolidate them and then try to get her into an income-driven repayment plan? So that is generally, I would say that probably is what our work with about 80% of the borrowers we work with looks like. Is at the end of the day, we look for cancellation programs. Obviously, we have seen a spike in for-profit school-related discharges in the last couple of years. But for the most part, most people are looking to get their loans out of default and into an eligible repayment plan. So I have spent the vast majority of the time talking today about federal loans. And one of the reasons, there's a couple reasons why I spend most of the time talking about federal loans. First of all, federal loans make up over 90% of the entire student loan portfolio. So when we're talking about student loans, for the vast majority of folks, we're talking about federal loans. The other reason that we talk most about federal loans is because the options are very unique. That's actually not true for private loans. Private loans don't, though they do sometimes capitalize on the confusion. And a number of you guys have talked about the confusion and the complications with the loan system in the chat box already. But so private lenders will often capitalize on that confusion, and I have worked with borrowers who have had, debt collectors tell them that their loans, that the horrible things that the government can do to your loans, we can do those too. But that's generally not true. In general, private student loans are just like any other type of unsecured credit product. And the rules in place generally govern them just the same. So we're looking at state contract law. We're looking at the Truth in Lending Act. The one exception being bankruptcy is that there are private student loans are treated the same as federal student loans in the bankruptcy context. So again, that doesn't mean that you can't discharge your loans in bankruptcy, but it is harder. So how typically do folks resolve issues with private student lenders? So these issues may come up because they're getting collection letters, they have private loans on their credit report, or they have other documents. So you want to gather all of those documents. When possible, it's helpful to get copies of the promissory note and account history. One of the things, like other credit products, but unlike federal loans, private loans do have statute of limitations. And so you want to look out for those, especially if a borrower hasn't made a payment in a while. before you start advising them on how to get into affordable payment plans or what to do with it, you need to know when the last time they made a payment, because some statute of limitations are actually really short. And this is why you're going to want to get the promissory note, because the promissory note will let you know what statute of limitations are you looking for. Generally in contract law, you're looking at the law where the contract was made, but there are, in many private lending agreements, there are choice of law provisions. So many private lenders do choose other places to govern their contracts. And one place that private lenders like to choose is Delaware, for reasons that we know about Delaware law, is it's generally pretty corporate friendly. But one of the nice things about when they choose Delaware is it actually has a really short statute of limitations. It's 3 years. So I've certainly had a number of clients come to me having more than 3 years of missed payments on their private loan. So you need to do that kind of investigation. The last date of payment is also important for credit reporting considerations. But the other reason is that, there's not a lot of rules around private lenders about what they have to provide for borrowers. So we have 12 different repayment plans for federal loans. Private lenders can do whatever they want, really. It's going to be all governed by the promissory note and by their contract. Some have forbearances, some don't. Many charge for the use of forbearances, so you may have the option to stop payments for a while, but it may cost the borrower a fair amount of money to do so. And a number of them do promote cancellation programs for things like disability and death, but you want to look at the details about that. I had one borrower who canceled her federal loans due to disability, and then went to cancel her private loans with a lender who claimed to have a disability discharge program, but in that circumstance, instead of canceling the whole loan, all they offered to do was waive the remaining interest but none of the principal, which for that borrower was really just not very helpful or useful at all. So, you can dispute any amount with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and at that point, it's, borrowers need to make informed decisions about what to do about making payments. If they do want to try to resolve it, looking at the statute of limitations issues, making a payment on a loan where the statute of limitations has run can result in resetting the statute of limitations, so that period restarts all over again. But there are private lenders that are filing lawsuits. I see there's a comment here about NCT. They sue a lot, and they get a lot of default judgments against borrowers. So these are other things that you want to look out for. So that's the basic summary of what I have here. Some general resources for folks, again, going back to where to get information about the loans. I think if you're dealing with a student loan, unless you know that you're dealing with a very discrete private loan, like in a lawsuit issue, you need to have the borrower pull up their National Student Loan Data System report, because you need to know the universe of loans that they're looking at. Credit reports are also incredibly helpful. Not all loans are required to be, there's no requirement to report on the credit bureau, so it's not going to guarantee that loans don't exist, but it's going to give you a good snapshot of what the borrowers are looking at. Again, this is the link to our website, studentloanborrowerassistance.org, and the Department of Education. So we're moving here. We got about 5 to 10 minutes for questions, if anyone has any.
Yes, please share. While folks are thinking about that, I have one from earlier I can resend. It wasn't so much a question, but kind of a concern, and I wondered if you could talk about how you've seen this or any strategies, Persis. A lot of folks have mentioned, what are options when a default is due to identity theft by an abusive partner or the consequence of, coerced debt. And that's related to a similar question about, not having access to a lot of loan or financial information generally to figure out where folks are. So kind of two related questions.
Yeah, and the identity theft is one that's particularly challenging in the student loan context, both, for the borrower's own records, and then, dealing with the Department of Education. Unfortunately, the rules around identity theft are not particularly borrower-friendly. There is one of the cancellation programs is for false certification is on the basis of identity theft, but they will only cancel the loans if you have a judgment, which for folks who do a fair amount of identity theft work, that is basically unheard of. So, I was actually just on the phone with an advocate yesterday, struggling with a borrower whose it was their child who had taken out a Parent Plus loan in their name, and they were just not, they weren't willing to go. They weren't willing to get a judgment against their, against their child, which is also challenging to do. That's not necessarily a simple process, even if you are willing to do it. But the Department of Education generally isn't very sympathetic. Where there is a pressure point is often in defending on these loans. So if the borrower is subject to wage garnishment or Social Security offset or tax offset, that opportunity for a hearing, that is one of the opportunities to raise a defense such as identity theft, though there's no guarantees in that process. And again, we really hope that borrowers don't get to that point. But many of the solutions are unfortunately, just trying to make the loan as livable as possible. In terms of getting the documents, that's not easy to do from the Department of Education, but borrowers can often get copies of promissory notes. And, with a lot of work and a lot of elbow grease, sometimes if you can prove that signatures on documents don't match, the borrower's signature, which typically they try to have you come up with 6 signatures from the time period when it was signed, it is possible to get out of the loan obligation, though it is incredibly challenging and incredibly frustrating.
Well, that's helpful, and kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about, just talking with survivors and acknowledging how difficult it is and walking with them through that seems particularly important given how complex and lengthy the process is.
Yep, for sure.
Are there any final questions for Persis? I see somebody's typing. While I let that
So I do see, just kind of looking through the comments, someone asked about resources for building borrower defense claims. And so this is talking about when a borrower might have a defense to the repayment of their loan. And, I mean, first of all, I would encourage folks who are really digging in to get a copy of the manual that we have. We're very fortunate that actually one of the advocates at NCLC was a negotiator at the rulemaking where the borrower defense rules were initially drafted. And so, we have a lot of materials there for folks. But generally, folks need to, when you're looking at these schools where the borrower raises some issue. They lied to me about my job prospects is probably the most common complaint that I have heard, or about the assistance they would provide when going, after going to a school. And, often you can do Freedom of Information Act requests for complaints to your state. Many states have, licensing or other types of entities that will take complaints about career schools or proprietary schools. You can get complaints from there. You can try to do Freedom of Information Act requests from the Department of Education. So some investigations like that, getting copies of advertisements, any Attorney General actions, that sort of thing, to build the case. We build our borrower defense applications kind of like summary judgment motions, where you talk about what the law is in your state and then talking about how the school violated that and what harm that has meant for the borrower. That said, this so there's two components to borrower defense, is both the component about what the rules are, but then there aren't really timelines for the Department of Education to act. And so the other thing to know is that we've had borrower defense applications pending for years at this point. And so while we still file them when we think that borrowers have really good claims, I think it's incredibly important to manage the expectations of borrowers in these cases. And so then there's a question about debt from non-accredited schools, which has since become accredited. And this may be a nuance. I'm not actually a bankruptcy attorney, but I think that is a situation where I would suggest looking into bankruptcy as a possible option and kind of digging into the case law there. The school does need to be accredited. There is a requirement for schools to for the loan to qualify for this exemption under the bankruptcy code. So depending on, so I think those are circumstances where it's worth looking into whether or not the debt actually is, a student loan as defined in the bankruptcy code. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And then there's another question about applying for new loans for folks who have other bad debt caused by an abuser. Now, one thing about federal loans, and one can view this either as a positive or a negative, but generally they don't have underwriting standards. And so, if a borrower needs to go to school and they need to apply for federal loans or Pell Grants, unless it's a plus loan, and this is one of the exceptions where they do some kind of credit check, there are not credit checks for direct Stafford loans or Pell Grants. So that at least is one place where this is not a barrier.
That's helpful. Thank you.
And I do see that there are some other questions, and folks can feel free to follow up with me. I know that we're now kind of running towards the end of our time, but I have provided my contact information in the slides as well.
Yes, exactly. Keep those questions coming, and we'll give you Persis information, and we also have evaluation that we really use to kind of continue the conversation and make sure we're connecting dots. So I will share that link, and I think you'll receive it right after this webinar as well. So with the time remaining, what we thought we'd do, since a lot of your questions were about the long term and kind of thinking big picture, partnership strategies, thinking about how to assess kind of these needs on a bigger level, we thought we might close by doing a round robin with Persis as well as CSAJ's Erica and Yvette just on what you're thinking about after this webinar, opportunities that you heard, or any other kind of closing thoughts or questions for attendees to take with them. Anyone, maybe Erica or Yvette, wanna start us off?
Sure. This is Yvette. One of the main things that was on my mind was about strategies to really end the consequences to impoverished borrowers, sort of like taking their earned income tax credits, and what are broader advocacy strategies that would assist with, like garnishing wages and things like that, that would be more like just broad to borrowers in general, but also thinking about like whether there's anything specific that can be done specifically for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. So I don't have anything a whole lot deeper than that, but that's sort of where my mind is going.
I mean, I think that's really interesting, and one thing that, in the big policy questions about student loans, I mean, if you just, like, go really, really far back, like, student loans were designed to be a tool of access, right? That this is a tool that's supposed to promote access to higher education. And unfortunately for some of, the folks who we really want to get access to, what it winds up being is a really high stakes vehicle where if it works out and you use the student loan and you go to school and you get your degree and, the statistics do look in your favor in terms of increasing your lifetime earning, but the stakes if you don't succeed are extraordinarily high, or if something happens, and I do get stories a lot from folks who have to leave school because of an abuser or because, either because they're, fleeing for safety or because, they experienced, sexual violence and they just had to leave. They couldn't continue their education, and they're on the hook. I mean, there's a number of other, other circumstances that prevent people from continuing their education, and the stakes are incredibly high for those folks. We have, on kind of just the general policy level, tried to advocate to alleviate these, what we call them, incredibly draconian consequences, like taking the tax refunds, so that if nothing else, I mean, I would like to see that ended. I don't think we should be taking folks earned income tax credits, and I don't think we should be taking folks Social Security benefits, for example. But I think that there are, fixes that can be in the middle too of, well, can we only take the amount that the borrower didn't pay, and if they have no income, their IDR payment could have been zero. If their IDR payment could have been zero, can we just like not take their refund, or or other types of matching programs. The Department of Education is working with the Social Security Administration now and the Veterans Administration to at least figure out folks who are eligible based upon their statuses with those agencies for a disability discharge. And I'm hoping that, I mean, I'm not super hopeful, but I would like to see there be more programs where we can identify borrowers who really shouldn't be on the hook for these loans, and then not have them experience these consequences.
That's great. Thanks.
This is Erica, and my thought really is just more of a question for everybody, and a curiosity, because we really do have a very diverse group of participants today that are coming from very different spaces in terms of the work that you all do. So it seems clear to me that there's a lot of opportunities around building partnerships between domestic violence advocates and consumer advocates, between domestic violence lawyers and non-lawyer advocates. And so I'm curious about sort of what kinds of partnerships currently exist out in the universe, and just also curious about folks' interest in developing those types of partnerships in order to create the infrastructure that could better meet the particular safety and economic needs of survivors as it relates to student loans and educational opportunity, as Persis said, being a huge entryway to longer-term safety. So if folks want to share some of that with us, we would love to hear about it both now and after our webinar today.
Yeah, I love that. And I just shared the evaluation link, and like I said, you'll also get a direct notice about that when you log off today. So please keep sharing, and we'll follow up with opportunities to kind of re-engage on this. And so thank you so much. And Persis, I don't know if you have a final thought or question, or just thank you.
I really appreciate everyone's engagement, and I thought this was, I appreciated all of your questions and thoughts as we went along, and thanks to all of you at CSAJ as well.
Thank you so much. And just some final housekeeping. There's that evaluation form. There are a whole bunch of tools that we have that can kind of support you. Speaking of partnership building, that we'll be sharing about this. And don't forget the spotlights. So partnerships and spotlighting and sharing the strategies that work for you or that you're kind of struggling through. Engage us, reach out to us in that process so we can think with you through that. We are here and we will share all this information. Everything is being recorded and will be posted to our website, and you all will get direct notice of that via email when it's all packaged and ready for you. So just echoing Erica, Yvette, and Persis, thank you so much for sharing everything that you're bringing to the table today and your questions and your really good work. And we look forward to seeing you next time. We will be having a series on court-related barriers to economic security in the end of March. So stay tuned for much, much more, and contact us and look for some follow-up from us. And thanks again to Anna and Patricia at NCJ FCJ.